Over the past few programs, we've looked at reasons why governments intervene in the economy. They've included for environmental protection, the need for public goods, and for antitrust regulation. The goal has been to reduce inefficiencies that arise from market failures. In this program, we'll introduce a new reason. The governments intervene for reasons of fairness to solve problems of poverty by taking away income from the better off and giving it to those who are less fortunate. The main reason is the belief that the market system is unfair. As you can imagine, the question of fairness is exceedingly controversial. At one extreme are those who believe that the government should not interfere with the market at all, that the market distribution is fundamentally right, and that the government may do more harm than good. At the other end is the belief that income should be completely equal. In between, there are many possibilities. For now, let's avoid the fairness issue and instead look at some numbers that describe the distribution of income. Said before, people derive their income from three basic sources: wages and salaries, which is about 64%, income from the ownership of land and capital, which is 25%, and government checks, which is about 11%. Now, we've already talked about how labor market theory can explain some income inequality. Although labor markets aren't perfect, workers' wages reflect the marginal revenue product of labor, and that's defined as the price of the product multiplied by the marginal physical product. Here's the definition we saw before. The wage rate is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor, which is equal to the product price times the marginal physical product of labor. So some wages can be high because workers are highly skilled and very productive, so the marginal physical product is large. Others have high wages because the demand for their product is high, which drives up the product price. For example, there is a high demand for National Basketball Association games. Let's assume women basketball players have a marginal product that's the same as men's, and let's also assume the demand for women's professional basketball games is not nearly as great. So that means the price associated with women's basketball is much lower than that for men's. In symbols, we can write the cases of professional basketball players like this: that the marginal physical productivity of men is equal to the marginal physical productivity of women, but the price of men's basketball exceeds the price of women's basketball. So in this case, we predict that men will earn more than women. Well, now that we know what wages reflect, we can compute income. And it's simply wages multiplied by the hours worked. In this equation, we see Y sub L is equal to price times the marginal physical product of labor times hours. And here Y sub L is income and H is the number of hours worked. Well, this shows another reason for income differentials. Some people are simply willing to work longer, moonlight, and do without vacations in order to increase their incomes. In this case, most people agree that there is fairness on the side of the market outcome. Hard work should be rewarded. The second source of income is property income, which comes from owning stock, certificates of deposits, real estate, mining rights, patents, and so on. The origins of property income are savings and inheritance. Although most people receive very little income from inheritance, many famous families do. The University of Utah's Business College and this TV station are associated with the Eccles name. It's connected to a family fortune made in the banking industry. The market determines the prices of capital and land in precisely the same way that it determines wages. Again, we compute the factor's marginal revenue product. For example, according to the production theory, the price of capital, sort of its wage, is product price times the marginal physical product of capital. So just like labor income, capital income can be described by an equation. The income to capital is equal to the product price times the marginal physical product of capital times capital. Here we see Y sub K is capital income and K is the stock of capital owned. Every year, Forbes magazine compiles a list of the 400 richest people in the country. Several years ago, the article found that the richest person in the world was worth $5.2 billion, and the 400th richest was worth only $2.8 million. Of these 400, 40% inherited most of their wealth. So they inherited a large amount of capital. This is a source which not everyone would think is fair. Now, 54% started with modest or no assets, worked hard, had good luck, made profitable investments, and so on. Now, this is a source that most people, but not all, would think is fair. Luck may be a very important determinant of the income distribution because luck can change any parts of the equations we've written. It can affect the stock of resources that an individual has to sell. This can happen if you win the lottery, for instance, which suddenly increases your personal stock of capital. Or it can happen if you suffer a disabling accident or disease, which decreases your stock of hours worked. Of course, you may also increase your stocks of financial and human capital. Many of you might be hoping that by taking this course, your human capital will increase, and with it, along goes your income. Productivity can change too, but it's actually the most stable component of the equations that we've seen. Investments in human and physical capital commit people to particular markets and careers, and here again, luck is quite important. Luck's important because of the difficulty of predicting which products or services will enjoy a strong demand in the future. And that means to say that the product price is uncertain. The third source of income, which amounts to 11%, is in the form of government transfers. A transfer is a payment, either in cash or in kind, that doesn't commit the recipient to do anything. An important distinction is between welfare and social insurance transfers. An example of a welfare transfer is aid to families with dependent children, known as AFDC. Welfare transfers are typically income tested, which means recipients must prove that they are poor. For social insurance transfers, recipients must fall into a particular category regardless of income. For example, people who receive unemployment benefits don't have to prove that they are poor, only that they are unemployed. The largest program is Social Security. To receive benefits, recipients only have to be over the age of 65. As we said before, some transfers come in the form of cash, like a government check, and some are in kind, where goods and services are provided, like with health care benefits. Altogether, these distinctions produce the four categories shown in this table. In this table, we break down the types of income redistribution programs according to social insurance or welfare and cash versus in-kind for 1987. The social insurance cash variety, which includes unemployment compensation and Social Security, totaled $361 billion. The social insurance in-kind programs, including Medicare, amounted to $82 billion. Cash welfare programs, including AFDC, totaled $36 billion, and in-kind welfare, such as food stamps and Medicaid, totaled $103 billion. These distinctions are politically interesting. It seems voters prefer cash programs of the social insurance variety and welfare programs that are in-kind.
And now it's time for Chalk Talk with your host, Miss Sarah.
Now we're going to look at a Lorenz curve, which measures the income inequality or the distribution inequality of income in a society. For example, let's say we have a society with 4 people. And this society has very equal distribution of income where they all have $25. For a total of 100. This graph measures the percent of the population here, and up here, the percent of the income. So, the first 25%, in this case, the lowest 25% of the population have 25% of the income. The lowest 50% of the population have 50% of the income. The lowest 75% have 75% of the income. and the lowest 100 has 100% of the income. In that case, our Lorenz curve is a straight line, 45-degree angle. Now let's say we have a less equal distribution of income here. This person has $5, this person has 10, this person has 15, and this person over here has 70. Still totals out to 100, but it's a less equal distribution of income. In this case, the first 25% of the population only has 5% of the income. The lowest 50% of the population has 15% of the income, 10 plus 5. 75% of the population has 30% of the income. And then the last 100 has 100. And so our Lorenz curve looks something like that. So this straight line is an equal distribution of income. This curved line is a less equal distribution of income.
Now, when we talk about discrimination, we have to be, I think, pretty careful about definitions, and especially in distinguishing discrimination from general inequality. Wages vary for a lot of different reasons. The most obvious is probably differences in skill. If I have a great deal of skill, I can be very productive for you. You might be willing to pay me a higher wage. Other factors that make wages differ are things like working conditions. If it's a pleasant environment, I might be willing to work in such a place for a lower wage. If I'm getting something else out of the job besides wages, like training of some kind, I might be willing to take a lower wage. So before we can talk about discrimination, we need to, in some sense, take out all of those other sources of variation in wages in order to get at, what is simply pay difference between black workers and white workers and men and women. And so to define discrimination, I think we'd want to do it just that way. What's sort of the wage inequality that's left over, variation by ethnic group or by racial group or by gender left over after we take out all these other sources of inequality. Another thing that we have to be careful about when we talk about labor market discrimination is to keep in mind that on the one hand we're trying to distinguish it from other forms of discrimination in the economy, housing discrimination for instance. But we also have to recognize that these things are interrelated. If I can't get a loan, a mortgage loan, I'm forced to live in a certain kind of neighborhood. That affects the kind of school I can get into. That affects the skills I have. And then I may be paid fairly by the labor market for those skills, and yet it's still clearly true that the wage that I get is affected by a discrimination process, just a different kind of discrimination process. So we need to keep that broader context in mind.
We will match your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering.
Well, if we look at just the amount of inequality between these groups at this point in time, if you compare black men to white men, full-time workers, you find that black men earn on average about 75% of what white men earn. And then if you try to take out the amount of that inequality that's due to all those other things I talked about, things like differences in experience or training or schooling, you find that what's left over is black men earning about 85% of what white men earn among full-time workers. So you can explain about 10 points of that 25-point gap with other differences between workers, and you've got about 15 points left over that you might want to start to think about as discrimination. If you compare black women to white women, you get something quite a bit different, actually. The ratios are a good deal higher. Black women make, in the early 1990s, about 90% or more on average of what white women earn. And when you take out these other differences, schooling and so forth, you come out with essentially wage parity. If you compare women to men, and you look at averages, the ratio right now would be around 70%, women earning about 70% of what men earn. That represents a considerable amount of increase since the early 1980s. A lot of that has to do with increases in the average level of experience for women, and that's beginning to raise wages for women. If you take out the remaining differences in experience, you end up with a ratio of women earning about 80% of what men earn. So in each of these cases, you can explain, although that's too strong a term, you can explain about a third of average wage inequality by accounting for other differences between workers. And then you've got differences of 15 to 20 points left over that appear to be something we'd really want to call discrimination. But you get different estimates depending on sort of which studies you look at. how narrowly people think you should define the group. Should we just compare men and women in exactly the same job? If you did that, you'd get an even higher number. But in some sense, that would be failing to take account of things that are probably elements of labor market discrimination, like the process of getting into that job.
54 million men and women, more Americans than ever in our history, are working today more and more on war production jobs.
Economists have a variety of theories for why discrimination takes place and maybe persists in the labor market. And they kind of cover a real wide range. The simplest, perhaps most obvious kinds of theories have to do with simple ideas about racial or ethnic antagonism, or the notion that employers of one group wish to have some social distance from workers of another group, or workers of one group want to have distance from workers of another group, or customers want to have distance from workers or retail workers of another group. And if that kind of process is going on, you can imagine that that's going to reduce the demand for minority labor. It's going to reduce wages and access to certain jobs. So that's one kind of theory that you have. A similar kind of thing suggests that the notion is not so much antagonism toward other groups, but maybe a desire to funnel resources to members of my own group, so that if I gain a particular niche, an advantageous position in the economy, I might want to use that to funnel jobs or opportunities to members of my own community. And again, that's going to potentially reduce the demand for minority workers and reduce wages and occupational position. Another kind of theory relies less on notions of racial animosity than on notions of lack of information. We live in a fairly highly segregated society in many ways. And if majority employers, white employers, feel that they don't have a great deal of information about the skills that, say, African American workers bring to the labor market, then they may be hesitant to hire those workers into certain kinds of jobs. Not because of any sort of simple desire for distance, but rather just a notion that I'm not sure what the skills are that are embodied there. If you don't have a lot of information, you might operate on stereotypes more often. And then that's going to produce, at least for a period of time, potentially lower wages for minority workers. And there are a variety of other models that are out there as well, a real broad range of explanations.
We will meet your physical force with soul force. We will not hate you, and yet we cannot in our good conscience obey your evil laws.
We don't want to think of discrimination maybe as just one thing, one unified problem in the economy. It seems to me that the explanations that I've just given probably wouldn't work that well for an explanation of why men and women differ in wages and occupational position, because society is not segregated by sex the way it's segregated by race, for instance. And so I think you need a different set of explanations, and I think that the set of theories that we've developed don't work as well for explaining gender inequality. And so you need to perhaps look to other sort of schools of thought, other camps, for explanations of these things about sort of the desire, say, for men to hold power within the household. The more resources that you control that are coming into the household, the more power you might have in decision-making within the household. And that might create an incentive for men to, by whatever means, to sort of maintain a wage advantage over women. So I consider that to be a much more complex kind of problem to get a sort of a simple model for.
Given this background, we can now try to get a picture of income inequality in the United States and compare it with other countries. This table describes the result of ranking all American families from the poorest to the richest and dividing them into percentile groups. The first row shows the income of the poorest 20%. In 1980, we see the poorest group earned 5.2% of all the income. The next row shows that the next poorest 20%, who earned 11.5% of the total income in 1980. Now we've added these two numbers to get the cumulative percent for both groups. So 16.7% of all income is earned by the bottom 40% of the families. By contrast, the bottom row describes the richest 5% of the population, and they earned 15.3% of all income. A nice way of graphing this is to plot the percent of total income on the vertical axis and the percent of the population on the horizontal axis. So let's take the lowest 20% of the population. They earned 5.2% of the income, so we plot 0.1. The lowest 40% earns 16.7%, so we mark 0.2. Continuing this way, we see a graph, and that graph is called the Lorenz curve. Now, what would a Lorenz curve look like in the unlikely event that everyone earned the same income, or there was complete equality? The Lorenz curve in this case would be the diagonal line at 45 degrees. The result of such hypothetical equality would be that the lower 20% of the population would also earn exactly 20% of the total income, and the Lorenz curve would go up and follow the 45-degree line. The Gini coefficient is a numerical measure of income inequality that's derived from the Lorenz curve. To form the Gini coefficient, form the ratio of the red shaded area to the area of the triangle below the 45-degree line. Since the red area measures how far a particular distribution is from exact equality, a smaller red area means a lower Gini coefficient. So that means greater equality. The World Bank has published coefficients for many nations. They range from about 0.25 to 0.60. Many countries, especially third world ones, have much less equal distributions of income. This Lorenz curve shows the distribution of property income is heavily weighted towards the rich, and the transfer income is weighted in the opposite direction, towards the poor. In fact, for transfers, the Lorenz curve is above the 45-degree line. At the beginning of the segment, we ask an important question. What is a fair and just distribution of income? Well, one answer is that whatever the market throws out is fair. Another answer is that the only right distribution is for complete equality. Now, economists tend to think that the major problem with complete equality is that it destroys the markets for labor and resources by removing the economic incentives to supply the necessary factors of production. Without these sorts of incentives, some argue that those currently at the bottom of the current income distribution would actually be worse off under a system of complete equality. Why? Because the size of the total pie would shrink so much. Now, is there a Lorenz curve that many people would think is just? One economist, Lester Thoreau, has proposed an answer. He argues that the major objection to the market outcome is not so much that incomes under perfect markets are unfair, but the markets themselves are far from perfect. Why? Well, markets are imperfect because of monopolies and oligopolies. They earn large and unjustified profits for their stockholders and employees. The market is imperfect because women and minorities are crowded into particular occupations with low wages. Now, this is an equal opportunity view of fairness as opposed to an equal outcome view of complete equality. In essence, Thoreau suggests a leveling of the market playing field. The target for the entire economy should be current distribution of white male income.
Historical Moments with John Watkins, Ph.D.
John Kenneth Galbraith advocates an expanded role for government. Galbraith asserts that the market system is dominated by corporations. Corporations have a vested interest in increasing output. Why? Because corporations are in business to make profits. In general, increasing profits means increasing output. More cars, more televisions, more toys. To ensure that consumers purchase these goods, corporations spend billions of dollars on advertising to create consumer wants. In other words, corporations create and foster a culture of consumerism. We are bombarded with messages informing us that if we buy this product or that product, our lives will be happier. Galbraith's point is that consumerism leads to a social imbalance. Too many goods are allocated toward the private sector at the expense of the public sector. How is this possible? Galbraith argues that whenever a private good is produced, it always has a public counterpart. Private automobiles require public expenditures on roads, bridges, pollution control, and so on. Private homes require public expenditures on water, sewage, public parks, and so forth. Virtually all the goods we consume generate garbage, requiring public expenditures on landfills. Recreation vehicles, camping gear, and mountain bikes require public expenditures on national parks, forests, and campgrounds. Private investment in plant and equipment require public expenditures on education. The domination of the market by corporations, however, gives the appearance that private expenditures are socially beneficial. Public expenditures appear as an expense. Yet, for Galbraith, public expenditures are just as necessary as private expenditures. Galbraith's views had a considerable influence on Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. The effort to abolish poverty in the 1960s, in part, reflected the influence of Galbraith's ideas. His views are representative of the liberal position. Galbraith's view contrasts sharply with that of the proponents of the market. Proponents of the market assert that profitable activities are socially beneficial. Galbraith claims the opposite. Profitable activities leave social functions unfulfilled.
In this segment, we've examined some of the sources of income inequality and looked for evidence of it. The government has attempted to address the issue of poverty and inequality by redistributing resources. Poverty programs in the United States are largely non-cash programs, compared with larger social insurance programs that distribute cash to the elderly. Debates continue among economists on the effectiveness of programs to deal with inequality. Some say it's a part of, and in fact a desirable aspect of, a market economy, and attempts by the government to intervene cause more harm than good. The solution, they argue, is for enhanced economic growth. Others argue that our government does far too little to address the inequities inherent in capitalism and with market systems that play on uneven fields. They point out that in recent years, redistribution to the poor has drastically fallen in real terms, and that the poverty rate in the U.S. is higher today than it was 20 years ago. In exploring this issue, we continue to see cogent debate between economists on the extent to which the government should intervene in our economy. Remember, this was the same thing Adam Smith talked about over 200 years ago. I suspect it will continue into the future.